Hi all, Scott Jackson coming to you from the lands of the Pokagon Potawatomi, the Miami, and the Peoria. We welcome you to share your land acknowledgement in the chat below if you're so inclined. It's a beautiful day here, actually. Spring has finally sprung. The crocuses are just beautiful and gathered everywhere in my yard. And I hope the same is with you. And with that, I'm going to hand it straight over to Kate Powers. We're so excited that you're with us today. We got a tremendous guest with us today.
Hey, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. And I am thrilled to introduce Dr. David Pellow, about whom I am fangirling just a little bit. So bear with me. I'm a little giddy with nerdy enthusiasm. Dr. Pellow is the Delson Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and the Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at UC Santa Barbara. He teaches courses on social change movements, environmental justice, human-animal conflicts, sustainability, and social inequality. He has been prolific in his writing on environmental justice issues in communities of color in the US and globally. And I'm going to put his full bio in the chat because it goes on a minute. David, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Kate and Scott, and thanks so much for having me here. And a big thanks to Kurt for all the great work he has done. I'm super delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you all today and to exchange with you and learn from you. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. I am coming to you from what is now called Santa Barbara, California, which is unceded traditional indigenous Chumash land, territory, air, and water. And I just want to say thank you to so many Chumash indigenous community leaders and elders for giving me the opportunity as a representative of my institution, the University of California, Santa Barbara, for the opportunity to rebuild relationships of trust, respect, and reciprocity. So with that, let me see if I can do a screen share here. And there we go. Hopefully everybody can see that and hear me okay. All right. So I want to talk about environmental racism and the fight for environmental justice behind bars. And what really leads me to this is the discovery from a number of folks who have been incarcerated or currently incarcerated, who have taught me that prisons and carceral spaces are really sites of environmental racism and injustice, because so many of these facilities in the US and around the globe are sites where we find threats to human and more than human health. And so we see exposure to water contamination, the proximity of many prisons to hazardous industrial waste sites. We have a plethora of problems like airborne water toxins, excessive heat, and all sorts of other things, contaminated water, you name it, the list goes on and on. So I'm going to be talking about a bunch of those things today. Let me just run you quickly through the outline for what I want to do. I want to first start with the discussion of settler colonialism, define that, and talk about why that's relevant to prisons and environmental justice. Talk a little bit about environmental justice studies as an area of scholarship that I'm involved with, and of course as a movement that I've long been involved with, and then zero in on the case of carceral systems in the US and beyond, and then offer a few conclusions. So before I do that, I want to just lay out three guiding questions that really structure all of the work that I do, not just in terms of this presentation, but everything I'm doing. And these really sum up, I think, a lot of what folks who are scholars and activists in the environmental justice space are really concerned about. Not everything, but three of many things that people are focused on. And the first is just this basic question: how are social inequality and environmental quality linked? That is really the basic question of environmental justice studies, and I'll get into that a little bit more. And then, of course, we're very much interested in positive elements of this story. It's not all doom and gloom and how people are getting screwed over inside and outside of prisons and other communities, but what are people doing about it? And how are we shaping environmental policy across institutions? And then thirdly, we're very much interested in how we can improve the quality of life and well-being of humans, but also promoting ecological sustainability and seeing those two things as totally interlinked. And for me, that's what environmental justice is all about. So settler colonialism is sort of a foundation of this work that I'm doing. You know, I draw from the work of Potawatomi scholar and environmental and indigenous injustice scholar Kyle Powys White, who defines settler colonialism as a form of environmental injustice, because the entire settlement process, the invasion of outsiders onto what we now call the United States, really was aimed at directly undermining the conditions, the environmental conditions that are really necessary for indigenous peoples to exist, to practice their ways of life, their culture, their political self-determination, their economies. So settler colonialism really forms the foundation of much of my work. It's also a core foundation of the US prison system via this problem of human enslavement. And so if we look at the latter half of the 19th century, at least in what we now call the United States, the federal government, as we know, was leading a campaign of direct extermination and conquest against indigenous folks, many of whom were viewed as quote unquote hostiles because they were committing the outrageous crime of defending their land against an invasion. And for those folks who were lucky enough to be left alive afterwards, many of whom, of course, were placed in reservations, others of whom were actually placed in concentration camps, prisons, where mass starvation, illness, and death were really the norm. And so I'm actually inspired by the work of Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who recently wrote a book called City of Inmates, where looking at the largest jailer on planet Earth, the Los Angeles County Jail, and how that came to be. And over 3 successive regimes of the United States, of Mexico, and Spanish conquest, she really points out that the indigenous Tongva people in that region have known no history of human caging. There was no such thing as the idea of jail or prisons in their culture, in their history, until these invaders came along. So settler colonialism really, for many indigenous peoples, has really ushered in this practice of human caging. I want to make the argument further that human caging, which of course is a form of human enslavement, is an environmental injustice. And so I make that argument because human caging reflects the many ways that vulnerable and marginalized populations were in history and today continue to be forced into violent captivity that, as we all know, really results in long-term social and public health related harms to these individuals, but also to their communities more broadly. But it's also an environmental injustice. Caging of people, imprisoning people, is also an environmental injustice because it requires the simultaneous subjugation of our non-human relatives, of our ecosystems, of water, of land and other species for the construction and for the maintenance of the prison system. So these histories of settler colonialism, of what we would call racial capitalism, which is another way of just saying capitalism is racist and always has been, and enslavement really lay the foundation of today's prison system in the United States. And so finally, in terms of sort of building up these arguments, my view is that any form of environmental justice really needs to exceed the capacity of this nation's current policy framework. Because if environmental injustice is baked into, is integral to the United States culture, politics, and economy, because going back again to Kyle Powys White, if settler colonialism itself was and is an environmental injustice, then the founding of the United States itself was an act and a process of environmental injustice. So any effort to promote climate and environmental justice really has to say, look, we've got to get serious about decolonization and abolition. So I've been talking about environmental justice. Let me make sure that I put some punctuation there and put a fine point on that. This is a realm, a field of study that's been around for decades, where we've got solid evidence, right, of the correlation between race, class, immigration status, and other categories of difference and exposure to pollutants, right? So in other words, if you're a person of color, if you're a person, doesn't matter what racial or ethnic background you are, but if you're low wealth, low income, working class, poor, you are just more likely to live, recreate, and work in spaces, in environments that are going to be disproportionately polluted, right? This is also the case with respect to climate and injustices as well. So you're not only more likely to be facing air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, but you're also much more likely to be facing risks associated with climate change. Environmental justice studies is also very much focused on, as I said earlier, the positive elements, the positive dimensions of this, the transformative potential of people who are facing environmental injustice and environmental racism and their allies, their accomplices, to try to change that situation. And so this, of course, is what we call the environmental justice movement, and more recently, the climate justice movement. These are grassroots efforts in local, regional, national, and international scales that are really trying to turn the tide on this problem and create positive, transformative solutions. More directly with respect to prison studies, I'm drawing on a list of scholars and activists and formerly incarcerated folks who have been long writing about prison spaces as forms of racialized, gendered, sexualized, and classed and colonial oppression. And again, seeing prisons and carceral spaces as really part of the core logic of American society, of US American society, where folks are dominated for, in many cases, no reason other than the fact that they come from a particular background. And so unlike a lot of my colleagues, I'm a sociologist, unlike a lot of my colleagues in the criminal justice space or the criminology space, tending to embrace kind of reforms and tweaking of the system, folks in critical prison studies are very much embracing of the idea that reform is the least preferred solution and we're really moving toward abolition. And of course, that's a concept and a discourse that's in the last year taken on greater urgency with the movement for Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter movement really taking center stage in conversations about race and criminal justice in the United States. So in terms of what I've been doing, and I shouldn't say I should say we, that is me and a whole host of wonderful students and allies. The Prison Environmental Justice Project is what I call this work. It's been going on since about 2015, primarily focusing on the relationship between prisons and jails and detention centers in the US and around the world and environmental justice concerns. And as I say, phase one is the US, but I'm moving more and more into a much more global focus. And we're using a whole host of research methods to gather data, to gather testimonials from currently formerly incarcerated folks, their allies, family members, lawyers, journalists, and other activists who are working in this movement. One really amazing group of folks is associated with the Prison Ecology Project, and they've kind of morphed into another group called the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. And so these are folks who are partners and collaborators in this multi-year project who are really helping me to work to translate my much sort of more nerdy academic findings into action in support of the rights of imprisoned folks and in support of environmental justice in carceral spaces. So, so anything that I say today that might strike you as novel or insightful probably comes directly from these activists and from folks who have been incarcerated. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very much interested in the ways in which prisons and carceral spaces are sites of struggles for environmental justice. And this is for at least two reasons. There are spaces where we see the harms of environmental threats, but also prisons and carceral facilities more broadly themselves produce environmental harms. So for example, a recent study showed that prisons and jails in the United States are actually significant generators of greenhouse gases, contributing to global climate change. And for me, that, and so this comes from three reasons, right? The construction of prisons, the maintenance of prisons through the production of goods and services, and of course, the low wage labor that folks who are in prisons are actually producing, actually in and of itself allows for the expansion of economic growth more broadly, nationally and globally, which is then associated with increases in climate change inducing gases. And what that study didn't show, though, but is really important, is that this is a compounding, layered reality then, because the very same populations who are facing climate injustice and environmental racism, right? that is working class folks and people of color and immigrants, are also, as we know, the primary populations who are facing the climate and environmental injustices of being locked up in prisons and jails. So they're getting it coming and going on both sides of the prison walls. So let me talk a bit about social inequality and incarceration. So for the next several slides, I want to talk about how carceral spaces really across the board impact people across a whole spectrum of social identities. And for me, this is important because it allows us to understand that this affects a whole lot of folks, and that race and class, which I'm going to talk about in a second, are just two ways that we think about social inequality in the spaces of prisons and jails. So let's talk about race and class. Unless you've been living under a rock, I think we all know that certainly the US prison system is overwhelmingly made up of people who are poor or low wealth, low income, and non-white. That's indisputable. And I love this placard, say it out loud: the whole damn system is racist as hell. Very true. It's also classist as hell. We in the United States are proud that no country incarcerates more women than us. We lead that in terms of the world population. And of course, women are among the fastest growing groups of prisoners in the United States and face a hell of a lot of health risks as a result. We'll talk about that as well. If you're an immigrant, particularly if you're undocumented in the United States, as we know, you're at great risk of colliding with the police state and ending up in what we euphemistically call these detention centers, or family residential centers, as one in Texas is called. This is the Northwest Detention Center in the Seattle-Tacoma area, privately operated prison designated, designed to house some 1,500 immigrant detainees. This prison is built smack dab right next to a federally designated toxic Superfund site. And folks inside the prison have been resisting, and they have allies on the outside, a group, I think it's called the Northwest Detention Resistance Network, who have been working with folks inside this prison and to get their messages out to the public, and to also reframe the narrative of why they're there in the first place. One small but important part of that is that in many cases, people were fleeing their countries as a result of a whole host of reasons, one of which, in many cases, is, of course, the ravages of climate change. So again, many of these folks are getting environmental harm hitting them, coming and going. Let's talk about disability. We talk about race, class, gender, immigration status. This is a front page of a report put out by Human Rights Watch in 2015 that showed that in many prisons around the United States, people with disabilities are targeted for what I call chemical warfare. They are directly sprayed with chemical sprays, OC spray, by their corrections officers as a result of being given commands or orders that they, unlike other folks, might not follow or respond to in the ways that correctional officers would like them to. They may be slower, maybe they didn't hear them, maybe it didn't compute. And so they're often punished for having maybe sort of non-normative responses to everyday orders. And this can lead to asphyxiation, the burning of skin, eyes, and even death. So my hat is off to Human Rights Watch for doing this report. Let's talk about youth and age. A few years back, when everything was blowing up around lead water poisoning in Flint, Michigan, and by the way, even with that legal settlement, that struggle continues. In the state of Oregon, the many governmental authorities were wondering, I wonder if we might have lead poisoning situation here. Let's maybe test our water. So they did that in the schools, but someone at the Oregon Youth Authority, and this is a picture of the headquarters there, the Oregon Youth Authority decided, let's do that in our juvenile prisons as well. So out of the 11 juvenile detention centers, the juvenile prisons in the state of Oregon, fully 9 out of the 11 had actionable levels of copper and lead in their drinking water. So we had these youth ages 12 to 25 years of age who were already being subjected to, as I call it, the inherent environmental injustice of being locked up in a prison. And then compounding that is the fact that then they're being forced to drink water that is unsafe. So we've got all of the environmental injustices across race, class, gender, age, immigration status, disability status. There's another category I want to talk about, and that is species. Of course, this doesn't just impact human beings. This impacts non-humans as well. So here's a bit of a collage of a few photos that come to us from Letcher County, Kentucky. This was the site of the largest and most expensive federal penitentiary in U.S. history, USP Letcher. It would have been placed, and so that's why I got that picture of the dollar signs of the dollars on the top. The lower left hand is a site of mountaintop removal. Mountaintop removal is a practice, a super violent practice that corporations engage in, where you're just literally blowing up mountains to get to coal seams. So rather than the old way of sort of sinking a shaft and having human beings go out and do this very difficult work of extracting coal in this traditional sense, Donald Trump and his ilk are apparently very unaware of the fact that the coal industry isn't actually interested in producing more jobs. They're interested in getting coal. And this is a very efficient, if not horrifying way of doing that, literally blowing up mountains. And so this is a site where they were going to be putting this prison. So you have layers of violence on top of layers of violence. Mountaintop removal blew up a mountain, no longer exists. Hey, we need jobs. Let's put a freaking prison there. This prison would have been also in fairly close proximity to communities that are low income and high percentages of people of color. So there again is an environmental justice concern. But then on the lower right, we got this little critter, the gray bat, close cousin of the Indiana bat, both of whom are endangered species, both of whom have a habitat right there where this federal penitentiary were to be based. So we have multiple categories of beings here, both human and non-human, who would be affected by this prison. What I talk about now is a little bit of history there in Letcher County. There's a long history of coal mining. One source that I looked at counts about 70 different coal camps and coal communities in that county alone from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century. If we go back to 1820, which is pretty roughly the year when the coal industry really got ginned up in the state of Kentucky, we saw hundreds of active coal mines right after that. But if we go back even further to 1792, when Kentucky was declared the 15th state in the Union of the United States, we had a problem. We had literally dozens of indigenous communities there, well over 20 actually tribes, nations who were there at the time, most of whom were displaced and dispossessed and moved out, including, of course, the Cherokee, pushed out to the Oklahoma Territory as a result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which again was just a decade, a short decade after the coal industry really began in this part of the country in Letcher County. So this is a story that could be summed up as a journey from Indian removal to mountaintop removal. But there is a bright spot. In June of 2019, a large coalition, 21 persons who were incarcerated and their allies, including human rights attorneys across the country, came together with grassroots activists on the ground in Letcher County, Kentucky, who had been working for years to keep this prison from being built. And they succeeded in stopping this prison from being built. The Federal Bureau of Prisons withdrew its proposal, its application from consideration as a result of that grassroots organizing. So that was a major victory for prisoner rights, human rights, and environmental justice. So what I want to talk about now is the basics: bodily integrity, food, water, and medicine. Things we all need, things that are allegedly guaranteed if you're looking at international human rights law, but are of course routinely denied in prisons in the United States and around the world. Sexual violence is what I and a number of activists and scholars are now taking a close look at and really redefining as a form of environmental injustice. And we do this in a number of ways, looking at the work of a number of feminist scholars and scholar activists, thinking about our bodies, human bodies, as sites of struggles for environmental justice. Really makes sense, because they say, well, look, if we're talking about whales and dolphins and polar bears and their bodies, we automatically think, oh, that's an environmental issue, right? Well, why isn't it an environmental issue if we're talking about the bodies of human beings? particularly human beings who are vulnerable and marginalized. So we can reframe the struggle to take care of our bodies as an environmental justice struggle if we think of our bodies as some people call it, the first environment. And so assaults against that first environment, our bodies, can also be thought of as environmental injustice. And therefore, sexual assaults can be thought of as environmental injustices. And of course, as we know, anybody knows anything about carceral spaces, many people are subjected to this kind of violence. In particular, of course, female LGBTQ plus folks. It's really, really endemic. Recently I've been studying sexual violence in East Turkestan, which of course is traditional territory of a whole host of groups, including Kazakhs and the Uyghur folks, the Uyghur community, who are under siege by the Chinese government as that empire is expanding, building on the previous expansion of the Soviet Empire into Uyghur territory, trying to get access to oil, gas, and other ecological wealth. And what we're seeing then, of course, as a result of Uyghur resistance, or Uyghurs just being in the way of that so-called progress, people in the Uyghur community in the tens of thousands are being rounded up and placed into concentration camps. One of the many horrific things that's happening in those concentration camps is forced sterilization, which if there is a form of sexual violence out there, that's it. That's one of many forms of sexual violence the Chinese state is perpetrating against Uyghur folks. So if you think about this as a form of environmental injustice, this form of sexual violence, you can then connect the micro scale of what's happening to Uyghur folks' bodies and the resistance that they are engaging in against that sexual violence to this broader problem, this political, economic, cultural problem of the Chinese empire trying to grab their land. So I'm very serious about making those links. And again, building on the work of other scholars and activists. Thinking about other basic needs, we can talk about food. These are photos of, and I would put the word in quotes, meals that were served to imprisoned persons in Texas just a few weeks ago in February of this year, during the big, massive polar vortex, the huge storm, the winter storm that hit. These photos were taken, as you can imagine, by imprisoned persons using contraband cell phones. This is the only reason why we have this information, because imprisoned folks decided to do that work and to take that risk. So food injustices are linked to environment and climate injustice concerns because, of course, they reflect the ways in which marginalized populations' access to key ecological resources, food, are controlled by and curtailed by dominant institutions. And so we have companies, in addition to the actual jailers, we got companies like Trinity, Aramark, and others, which are really controlling the market for food and making large profits by providing horrendously bad quality food to people in jails and prisons around this nation. And not surprisingly, as many of us know, hunger strikes by imprisoned folks are many times aimed at improving the quality of food as one of the many demands. And of course, agriculture contributes to a significant percentage of global greenhouse gases, and the animal-heavy agriculture that many prisons rely on is particularly implicated in this process. So I interviewed a man, Benjamin, who spent many years at a prison in California, and he told me that, quote, food, I can't count on my fingers and toes the many times that I've gotten uncooked chicken, rotten or moldy food. Many times this has happened. It was really bad. It was not good. These are the kinds of stories, the narratives I hear from currently and formerly incarcerated folks all the time, and not news to anybody on this call, I'm sure. This is a rather grainy image from inside an imprisoned person's cell at Avenal Prison, and it shows quite clearly in the tap water coming out of his sink that is just brown, totally disgusting. This is par for the course in so many facilities. And he, of course, took this photo with a contraband cell phone. One person I interviewed told me, quote, the water was black. Most of the time, it was black. And if water is life, as we've often heard, right, from our Dakota brothers and sisters, then the fact that it is difficult to find a jail or a prison in the United States without contaminated water really highlights the reality that the carceral system is at minimum a space of constant threats to health and well-being, and at its worst, a site of death and ecocide. I don't want to beat up too much on the United States because, as we know, we go to other parts of the world and it ain't pretty either. This is a photo from Haiti's largest penitentiary, where diseases like cholera travel quickly throughout this prison. Scores of inmates die every year of TB, of tuberculosis, at this prison. During one journalist's visit to the prison's infirmary, they found more than 150 tuberculosis patients there at a single time. One imprisoned person told them, quote, "We can't get proper medical care in the prison. It's stressful. We're thinking of our children, our wives and families who are on the outside, and it makes you ill," unquote. In other words, the stress, the anxiety of improper medical care, which is really par for the course in any prison that I've seen, is an additional health risk itself on top of in this case, the tuberculosis that these folks are already facing. And this photo is of a cell where there are 18 beds, but 60 people, imprisoned folks, doing time. And of course, in this current era of COVID-19, as we all know, social or physical distancing under such circumstances is literally impossible. Okay, let's move on to another major environmental issue I've talked a little bit about. I'm particularly interested in how carceral institutions are affected by and themselves shape the direction and the impacts of climate change and the experiences of climate injustice. So when I say climate injustice, of course, it's a term that I use to describe the uneven and the unfair impacts of human-caused climate change on many of the world's vulnerable populations. And so specifically, we're talking low wealth, low income folks, people in the global South, people of color, BIPOC folks, indigenous folks. These communities are hit first and hardest by the effects of climate change. And it's an injustice, not just because of that, but because these are the very communities that actually contribute the least to the problem of climate change, because they're actually contributing the least in the form of contributing the fewest number of greenhouse gases. The level of carbon emissions from poor and communities of color is significantly lower than what we find in other communities. This is a satellite photo of SCI Fayette, State Correctional Institution Fayette, a prison in the great state of Pennsylvania. It was built in 2003 and is an example of environmental and climate injustice for a whole host of reasons. First, the prison itself was built on top of a former coal strip mine. Strip mining is a process, of course, that lays waste to a landscape. I mean, certainly mountaintop removal is bad. Strip mining is horrific as well. So it's already on a waste dump, right? Second, there is a sewage treatment plant right here on site. Treats sewage not only from the prison, but from the nearby town of LaBelle, which means you have an imprisoned population that is forced to live adjacent to a waste site, two waste sites, right? Third, as you can see from the middle of this photo, this graphic here, there is a massive refuse site that hosts some 40 million tons of coal ash. I can't even wrap my brain around how much that is. 40 million freaking tons of coal ash. What is coal ash? It's the waste that comes from coal-fired power plants. Coal-fired power plants are the #1 contributor to global climate change. So in this one photo, we have all of these deep, deep challenges and risks and issues coming together, right? At the global scale, from climate change and climate injustice to the local scale, to the micro scale. So let me give you an example of that. Richard Mosley served time for many years at SCI Fayette. And I spoke to him and he told me the following, quote, "I arrived there in 2009 and I was in great health. I was an athlete and a non-smoker, but within a week of arriving there, my nose started bleeding. I had breathing problems and I got really sick and had other respiratory problems. I had no idea about coal ash, but I got so sick that, and I'm telling you the truth, I kept a letter on me that I would have officials mail to my family in case I died. Luckily, my health has improved since I left SCI Fayette. I'm almost totally back to my original health, end quote. So here again, we see this micro scale and the macro scale intersecting as Mr. Mosley's body was temporarily ravaged by the same substance that is the leading contributor to global anthropogenic climate change. It goes deeper than that because, I always say, if you don't give a shit about prisoners and you only care about yourself, me, okay, that's fine. You should actually care about prisons then, because this environmentally unjust situation here that is affecting the health of the prisons, the folks in the prisons, is also not surprisingly affecting the health of the people in this town of LaBelle, many of whom have also reported some of the exact same health symptoms that Mr. Mosley had, that if you look at the medical journals and literatures, you'll find, oh yeah, exposure to coal ash, it leads to all sorts of respiratory disorders. Not a shock. So the people of LaBelle, Pennsylvania, and the imprisoned folks at SCI Fayette, and the corrections officers, and anybody who gives a damn about prisoners and climate change, all should care about what's happening in this particular site. So we've got a lot of challenges going on with respect to climate change. Let me jump over to Puerto Rico. This is a map of some of Puerto Rico's main prisons. In the fall of 2017, Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico extremely hard, as we know, flooding many parts of the island, placing many people's livelihoods and lives at risk. So there are, in my view, few places more terrifying to be during a climate change-driven extreme weather event than a prison that you can't get the hell out of that is flooding, where you've got water coming up around your ankles up to your waist, right? Puerto Rico has 29 territorial and federal prisons that, as you can see on this map, are clustered around 8 different complexes across the island. Most of them are along the coast and near high-risk flood areas, thus placing imprisoned human beings in greater harm's way, creating yet another layer of environmental and climate risks that intersects with carceral systems. So as in other parts of the US, we see continued concerns that imprisoned folks are not always evacuated when flooding impacts these sites. And so this is something that incarcerated persons' family members and allies have really taken up as a cause, really just pounding the prison authorities to get their relatives and their loved ones to safety during these extreme climate change-driven weather events. Speaking of climate change, we go to the great state of California, where I am based, and we have this well-known problem, and some would say an opportunity. So it's a complicated situation where fully 1/3 of our firefighting workforce are in prisons. And these folks are being increasingly pushed into the dangerous practice of firefighting in an age of rapid and violent climate change. Even Vice President Kamala Harris got into a little bit of trouble a little while ago when she was talking about, hey, maybe we don't need to embrace early release for folks who are imprisoned in the state of California, because anybody with a brain knows that climate change is real and that the wildfire season in California is no longer a season, it's year round, and we need people to fight those fires. And we got these folks who are incarcerated. Why would we let them out early when we can basically entice them to do this work? Well, this has been going on since about 1946, around the time, of course, of World War II, had created a shortage of firefighters. And so in that year, we had the very first, what we call conservation camp that was established. It was called the Rainbow Conservation Camp, and it was modeled after the earlier era of the New Deal Conservation Corps, right? So ever since then, the state of California has used imprisoned labor to address the increasingly lethal threats associated with climate disruption. So I'm an academic, so I'm a big fan and believer in history and the fact that history really matters and that it's alive and around us at all times. I spent 7 really good years in the great state of Minnesota, which folks who speak Dakota would call Minnesota Makoche, which means the land where the water meets the sky. And this is a rendering of the US military concentration camp known as Fort Snelling, which in the 1860s was one of these examples that I referenced early on of a concentration camp where quote unquote hostiles, indigenous folks, in this case Dakota people, who were resisting the European invasion, were placed. And here we had massive environmental injustice and human rights abuses, starvation, men were separated from women, reproduction was therefore not allowed. This was intended to neutralize these folks. And it was a particularly brutal illustration of human enslavement through settler colonial expansion. And so again, this is an example of environmental injustice because people and their lands were being exploited and harmed. And so keep this memory of this alive. This was also the site of the largest official state-sanctioned hanging, lynching. Many people would think, really? We thought that only happened to Black folks, and in some cases Latinx folks. Yeah, it did, but not only. 38 patriots, 38 Dakota resistors, and by patriots I mean people who were resisting the United States government's imperial expansion in favor of maintaining the integrity of their nation, the Dakota Nation. They were 38 resistors, patriots who on a single day were lynched, were executed by the US government. And so their memory lives on in the struggles of the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people. And of course, around that same time, right, in the 1860s, we had this 13th Amendment, which people are now waking up to and realizing was an allegedly anti-slavery document that was also simultaneously enslaving, right? We can get rid of chattel slavery formally, except for as punishment for a crime. And so we have, of course, then and now, this problem of continued enslavement. Here is a photo of African-American folks who were enslaved under the system of convict leasing, which of course was from the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And they were working, interestingly enough, for the Tennessee Iron and Coal Company, which, by the way, later merged with US Steel, creating the first billion-dollar corporation in United States history. So if they're working for a company called Tennessee Iron and Coal, what does that mean? Well, that means that these are Black folks who are enslaved, who are doing forced labor, who are extracting coal, which is contributing to global anthropogenic climate change. So once again, we see these intersections of racism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, human caging, and environmental and climate injustice. By the way, you may know this is among historians of convict leasing. Convict leasing, of course, is that system whereby governments, sort of doing a dragnet and grabbing folks of color primarily and enslaving them, caging them, and then leasing them out to companies who can do whatever the hell they want to with them, putting them to work like this. This was a far more brutal system than formal chattel slavery because, well, the companies didn't have to invest in making sure that these folks lived another day. As one guard, an inmate guard in Alabama, put it at this very coal mine, he recalls being instructed to shoot to kill any laborers, I would call them enslaved persons, who tried to get away, who tried to flee, because, quote, a dead convict didn't cost nothing, right? So it was a far more brutal system. There was no reason to keep these folks alive. So they were often worked to death. We also see this in the case of Parchman. Parchman Penal Farm back in 1901, prime location for growing cotton because it used to be a plantation. And here you have on the left-hand side people working in that agricultural space, all of them Black. And on the right, you have the prison warden's mansion, two very different ways of living. And so this really shows you that the plantations that were then converted into prisons really is an example of the continuity of white supremacy and enslavement in the prison system. 2019, a detailed report by Human Rights Group pointed out that very little has changed over the years, over the decades. Parchman in 2019 was reported as lacking water, lacking lights, lacking electric power, toilets and sinks not working, roofs leaking. There was mold, there were vermins, rats, everything. Everything was rusting up. So it's in many ways a full-scale environmental and public health nightmare. So the point I'm making, of course, is the more things seem to change, the more they aren't. This is a photo of Eastman Unit, a prison in Texas, where many environmental justice struggles have been ongoing over the years. I interviewed a journalist, Candace Byrne, who's from Texas, who interviewed a politicized prisoner named Keith Malik Washington, who was an environmental justice activist while he was in prison there. And she recalled what it was like to drive up to this prison that used to be a plantation, Eastman Unit. Quote, even 100 years later, as it became a prison in which prisoners were then working the land, as I drove up, I saw men out there working on the land. They were majority Black and brown, working that land as prisoners. And it sort of struck me. It was like an entire evolution of the prison plantation system in one piece of land that you could see across 100 years. And I feel like that kind of stayed with me and really struck me as I was driving up. We have slavery right now, and nobody blinks at it. I would be remiss in talking about how history matters for people of color and other folks who have been in prison if I don't also mention, particularly in this moment of anti-Asian and anti-Asian American violence being spiking, the fact that Japanese American folks, tens of thousands, were forced into concentration camps during World War II in the United States as a result of an executive order issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt out of the fear, the very misplaced and proven ill-gotten fear that the folks of Japanese descent were more likely to be loyal to the Japanese empire than they might be to the US empire. Simply not true. And from an environmental justice perspective, there are many layers here, one of which is the fact that in many of these concentration camps, the water delivery system, that is the metal pipes that were being used to store and deliver water, in many cases had been repurposed from when they had previously been used on US military bases to store and deliver oil, fossil fuels, petrochemicals. So they took those same pipes and then repurposed them for water storage and delivery for these concentration camps, thus revealing this environmental racism problem where many Japanese Americans were drinking water that was laced with oil, laced with hydrocarbons, and that was just the beginning. All right, so talked about how folks across a whole range of social categories have been forced to deal in these concentration camps, in prisons, and jails, and detention centers with a whole host of environmental injustices. But I also want to underscore that folks are pushing back and have always pushed back. We know that. Wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. And so several examples here really illustrate, not even the full range and breadth of resistance, but just a slice. And so, as I mentioned earlier, hunger strikes, labor strikes, commissary strikes, and boycotts. Of course, imprisoned folks for decades have been using lawsuits, demanding access to showers and clean water. Here in the state of California, where we're dealing with perpetual droughts, imprisoned folks were allowed just recently 1, maybe 2 showers a week to save water. And this was pushed back by prisoners and their allies, demanding healthy food, demanding healthcare. For me as an educator, one of the most interesting things is that many imprisoned folks have been, as part of their resistance campaigns, demanding access to educational programs when they are not in evidence. And that sounds pretty tame, but one person I interviewed, Eddie Zhang, who's a Chinese immigrant who served many years at San Quentin, was thrown in the hole, thrown in solitary confinement for 11 months for agitating and organizing for ethnic studies, for Asian American studies education. He's now out, he's been released. He had a movement of folks rise up, a grassroots movement to prevent him from being deported. And now he supports prisoners in their efforts to demand their human rights, and has successfully created and supported educational systems in San Quentin and in many other prisons. This is Angola Prison, a site, of course, this of course used to be a plantation, one of the most notorious prisons in the United States. And this is also a site of resistance. Of course, this is a photo of workers, imprisoned folks, enslaved folks coming back from a work detail, all of them with hoes or shovels. And of course, they've got an overseer on horseback. Very little has changed in this prison. And folks, of course, are picking wheat, cotton, corn, soybeans, sorghum, you name it. But there's also resistance going on here. Going back to the 1930s, some of the most horrific forms of resistance reflect the horrific nature of this total institution. In the 30s, there were dozens of examples where imprisoned folks were literally slicing their Achilles heels and tendons to disable themselves so they wouldn't have to do the back-breaking work that they'd been forced to do. We go over to the close relative of Louisiana, and we find Texas, the great state of Texas, that same decade in the 30s and 40s, some 273 cases, reported cases of self-mutilation by imprisoned folks for the same reason, to resist that enslaved labor. And then of course today we find prisoners pushing back, but they've also got allies on the outside. Mothers of East LA, Critical Resistance. These are groups going back to the early 80s and the 90s who were drawing connections between human rights struggles inside prisons and environmental justice struggles outside prisons. And they brought some of the first lawsuits against prisons and proposals in places like Delano, California, and South Los Angeles. So there's a long and proud history of folks inside and outside promoting environmental justice. This is a grainy photo of an incredible bit of poetry released by one prisoner, incarcerated person, Gary Farlow. For me, it's powerful and heartbreaking, and just one example of resistance and people expressing their humanity from behind bars. He writes, just an excerpt here, "The chow hall is inedible. COs, corrections officers, think we're detestable, but what we eat is indigestible. Let's face it, life in prison is unlivable." Other examples of resistance, we go back to 2018, January 15th, Martin Luther King Jr. Day. On that day, numerous imprisoned persons throughout the state of Florida, across 8 carceral facilities, launched a strike, a work stoppage. They called it Operation Push, and their primary demands were very clear and concise. End prison slavery, stop price gouging, and fully return the parole system. They believe that these issues directly created the overcrowding that was responsible for much of the deplorable conditions in Florida prisons. And their statement that they released on January 15th in 2018 also raises a number of major issues that need to be grappled with, including the death penalty, voting rights, and environmental health conditions. Unfortunately, as we all know, where there is resistance, there is also repression. Kevin Rashid Johnson is a well-known incarcerated person and journalist, artist, and organizer in Florida state prisons. He wrote an article about that previous slide I just showed you about Operation Push, the resistance, the work stoppage by folks incarcerated. And that article was published online in 2018. And the following day, the warden, Barry Reddish, retaliated against him, retaliated against Kevin Rashid Johnson's use of his First Amendment rights, ordering that he be given a disciplinary infraction for quote unquote inciting a riot. And further, a few days later, Johnson was thrown into a cold cell with a broken toilet, no heating, and a window that was open, allowing the 30 degrees temperature cold to come in to the cell. So this graphic is of a letter that Mr. Johnson wrote stating that, quote, he was literally being tortured in retaliation for this article on prison strike and conditions by the warden. He went on and said, no heat, cell like outside, temp in the 30s, toilet doesn't work, window to outside doesn't close, cold air blowing in the cell. So that's, for me, a really, really powerful example of resistance and repression, which is why I make the argument that environmental injustice and environmental racism, whether it's inside prisons or wherever, is a form of warfare because it involves that direct assaults by states and state-supported organizations on entire communities, not just individuals. Furthermore, this is a form of warfare. Environmental racism is a form of warfare because it results in massive harm, not only to those communities, not only to those individuals, but entire populations and the ecosystems that we rely on. Again, going back to Kyle Powys-White's definition of settler colonialism as an environmental injustice, because it undermines our ability to feed ourselves, to thrive, to live, and be healthy. And third, environmental injustice is a form of warfare because it is designed also to maintain the health of those populations who are viewed as highly valued, people who matter, at the expense of people who apparently don't, right? And so this framing of environmental injustice is intended to offer an urgency-inducing way of thinking about the seriousness of long-term impacts of public policy and state-sponsored and corporate institutional violence, all of which, of course, have been intensified in this era of rising fascism. And so what this framing, I think, around warfare facilitates, in my view, is not just the phenomenon of understanding that certain folks are privileged and, by living in cleaner environments, while other folks are not privileged by living in poisonous environments, but in many ways, more importantly, how that privilege has been routinely weaponized. And so when we reframe environmental injustice and racism as warfare, I think we can more clearly see how dominant institutions view those of us who are suffering from and experiencing the ills of environmental injustice, not as quote unquote environmental justice communities, which is what many activists call them, but rather, and certainly not as innocent people experiencing environmental harms, but rather as targets, as enemies whose bodies, whose communities, whose identities, and whose knowledge systems have to be contained, have to be neutralized, and in many cases, frequently destroyed. So I want to end on a positive note and lift up this brother, BRYANT ARROYO, who's serving a life sentence in the state of Pennsylvania. Some years ago, Mr. ARROYO found out that the town supervisors in the town right next to his prison had unilaterally decided to bring in an $800 million coal gasification plant. This was going to be a plant that was going to, of course, create climate change inducing gases, but also put out particulate matter, pollution that would get into the lungs of people in the prison, including not only the incarcerated folks, but the COs and the wardens and the people in the nearby town. Let's go back to, of course, the case I mentioned earlier, SCI Fayette in Pennsylvania, where that coal ash dump was doing that violence. So Mr. ARROYO said, you know what, not going to happen. So he organized himself and 900 of his fellow inmates to write these petitions, circulate and sign these petitions, get the media, get lawyers, get allies and accomplices involved. And they succeeded in stopping this plant from being built, from like first brick from being laid. Stop this plant in its tracks, in a major victory for environmental, climate, justice, and prisoner rights and human rights. So in conclusion, I would say if this guy, BRYANT ARROYO, from behind bars in the belly of the beast of a penitentiary serving a life sentence, could perpetrate such great things, could promote and uplift the idea of human rights, prisoners' rights, climate, and environmental justice, lifting up himself and his 900 fellow prisoners for this incredible victory that we should all be thankful for because we're all benefiting from what he did, then surely the rest of us on the other side of the prison walls in the so-called free world can exercise far more power in the service of whatever struggle, whatever cause you want to embrace than you might have thought. So let's get to it. Let's do that good work. Thank you so much. And thank you to the incredible team of students who have worked with me over the years. So I'm happy to take comments and questions, and I'll stop screen sharing now.
Oh my gosh, David, thank you
Wow.
so much. That was so much. I want to invite people to ask questions, but I can also appreciate in my dramaturgical capacity that you might need a couple minutes to just like process what you want to ask a question about, because that was a lot of information. So I'm going to ask a question in the meantime, and then you can either throw questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and jump on in. Does that sound cool with everybody? Okay. So you touched on this a little bit, David, but I would love it if you could expound a little bit on, in some of your writing, you talk about expendability of certain human beings and how we need to make everybody indispensable. And I was wondering if you would just talk about that framing a little bit and help us understand that.
Sure, thank you. And by the way, just checking out the chat, a lot of great comments people have put in there. I really wish I could save this. Thank you so much, Kurt and Kate and others for dropping that in there. So yeah, thank you for your question. In terms of expendability, I think this is something that so many folks who are studying and advocating for human rights in carceral spaces and for environmental, climate, and food justice, I think we all know, but I think particularly among the scholarly community, where there is this hesitation to sort of put a more sort of ethical and moral and normative framework together and wrap your arms around that and say, I actually stand for something, rather than, oh, let's just let the facts speak for themselves and the data speak for themselves in a more kind of objective and disinterested approach. I just decided, let's actually just name this thing for what it is, which is a system that defines certain people and certainly certain non-humans as dispensable, right, as expendable. And so I wanted to flip that around and say, well, then, I think one way to combat that is to embrace an ideology or a political program that says, no, all of us are none, right, as one activist group that advocates for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated persons puts it. And I'm fond of quoting many climate justice activists, including the great Canadian journalist and activist Naomi Klein, who says, in order to change everything, we need everyone. And so for me, this has got to be a movement that isn't about, just, oh, people who look like me or people who think like me or people who've kissed my ring or contributed to my campaign or whatever. I've seen too much of that. This has got to be a movement that is super diverse and inclusive of everyone. And so my view is that if it takes everybody to change everything, then we are all needed to make a future that is resilient, that is ecologically sustainable and socially equitable. And that doesn't just mean a wide and diverse spectrum of human beings, but it also means we have to look at other species, because we have always been multi-species societies. And I think we need to wake up to that, which of course, many other communities, indigenous communities first and foremost, have always put that out there front and center. So I'm just paying closer attention to that. But yes, pushing back on this notion that certain folks are expendable. And that, of course, is exactly what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about. And pushing back on this silly notion that all lives matter when we're not paying attention to the fact that some lives actually matter less and don't matter. And so we need to promote that. So that's really where that's coming from. But also, again, pushing that beyond the human to understand that, for me, multi-species communities and lives matter as well. So I hope that answers some of the question.
Absolutely, yeah. Anybody have a question they want to ask right now, or is everybody still percolating?
Sure. Anything with the current administration? Do you have any access? Do you have anything because of every aspect of this?
Yeah, thank you, Tricia. So currently, I would say I don't have direct one-on-one access, but right around the time that she had announced she was running for office, for president, Kamala Harris's staff reached out to me and my team just around this question of, and I had a previous slide on this, around the question of incarcerated folks being firefighters and what could be done about that. And since that time, I'm really pleased to see, and I didn't have anything to do with this, other activists did. We see in the state of California, the governor signed legislation giving formerly incarcerated folks access to emergency management, medical technician certification, which was one of the primary obstacles for these folks getting then access to being allowed full-fledged certification as firefighters. So that obstacle, I think, has been formally, if not entirely removed, it's been sort of chipped away at. And so I don't want to give Kamala Harris too much credit for that. But I would also say, I would say, and I'm shocked that this is coming out of my mouth, but on the whole, I am largely pleased with at least the rhetoric, if not the action, of the Biden-Harris administration on certainly on climate and environment and environmental justice. They seem to be taking this stuff very seriously, and it's given me whiplash, this 180 from the previous administration to this one. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see that. But thank you for your question. Yeah, I'm not a big enough deal for them to actually reach out and be like, "Hey, David, we really need your advice." Largely because I'm known as an anarchist, and that probably doesn't go over too well. So, but thank you.
Thank you.
Kurt, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for your work and for being with us and sharing your work and connecting us. Really appreciate you. How do we get the whole truth of the impact of COVID-19 on the incarcerated communities? The death rate is under reported, and the impact on prisoners with bad health is not being reported, and how can we put pressure where we just want them to tell us the truth?
Yes, I think that's exactly right, Kurt. Thank you for the question. I don't know that I've got a good answer to that, but as you pointed out, I mean, we know the truth is being suppressed. A lot of folks have been giving a lot of grief to Governor Cuomo in New York for suppressing the truth, particularly around elderly care and assisted living facilities. And I'm glad people are putting the heat on him for that, because that was just dastardly suppressing that truth of our loved ones and the suffering that they've been going through in the state of New York. But yes, as you said, similar things are going on in California. And around the nation. I have to say, initially, I was really upbeat, last summer in particular, with the uprising around racial justice and how we saw these proposals for early release being taken very seriously. And in some cases, in many cases, people were getting access to early release precisely because of the overcrowding and the impossibility of physical and social distancing in carceral spaces. But we've seen, I think, a real pushback and a slowdown and a foot dragging on that. And so people are, at risk as high as they've ever been. One thing, a colleague of mine, Dina Montague, who's on my team, she's leading a project looking at COVID-19 in prisons in California and from an environmental justice perspective. And she actually got a story on what's called the California Report, which is our state sort of public radio engine. And part of what she's doing is gathering the stories of folks who are currently incarcerated and people who have been released very recently. And so just getting their narratives, their first person testimonials, which I think in many ways are going to be far more moving than maybe a graph or a chart that somebody like me might present. So I think that's part of the story, is getting that story out and getting the media to cover that. I'm also impressed with, I think it's at UCLA, and there have been a number of other projects at UC Irvine and other universities where they've got graphs and maps and graphics showing the number of folks, and I don't know how accurate that is, but the number of folks who are being infected and dying in our carceral spaces, at least in the state of California. And it's off the charts. It's extraordinary. I don't know how many folks are looking at that, how many decision makers are looking at that. One of our congresspersons, Salud Carbajal, is on record in an interview that my team did with him, saying that exactly what you have said is completely unacceptable. And in the Lompoc prison here in northern Santa Barbara County, the numbers of folks being infected is it's ridiculous, and that there has to be a better way to achieve, whatever it is people want to achieve in terms of criminal justice and safety, but also health. And so I think it's going to be the post-mortem, and I use that term deliberately, is going to be one where we have to, after COVID dies down, going to take a very serious look at this situation. And my hope is that decarceration and abolition continue to be front and center in this policy discussion, because it is physically impossible to physically distance in prisons. And for me, that's an opportunity to promote much more transformative and radical approaches to the criminal legal system. So that's all I got, but you knew all that, and I'm in agreement with everything you said, Sartha, so thank you.
I'm just wondering also, for those of us on the call who are eager to get back inside, right? If there's an opportunity for us to help capture some of those stories once we get back in the circle with our respective communities, right? To whether that's through writing prompts or, just conversation in the circle, if there's a way to start to capture some of that.
I think that's exactly right. And, I know a number of incarcerated folks have said, the Inside Out programs, the prison education programs, the writing programs have, of course, so many of them have ground to a halt. Speaking to somebody the other day on a contraband phone from a prison in California, who was just saying, we've had no access to these programs. And that would be, as you said, Kate, a really great way for getting those stories out, getting that truth out that Kurt was talking about, but also a way for people to process, and manage and speak about it in a therapeutic way, how they're getting along and surviving. So yes, so the minute folks have the opportunity to get back inside, I think that would be right on point. That would be an amazing thing. I would love to see some of those education programs really put the COVID-19 pandemic front and center, because I think, it's clear to anybody looking at what's happening in prisons and more broadly in this country that there needs to be massive investments in public health education and understanding how these things work, so that people who are denying the reality of these things are given a chance to really be heard, but also given the opportunity to be educated. And I think carceral spaces are a really great place, ground zero, for maybe even overhauling how we've been doing education and curriculum programs on the inside. So thank you.
Sort of tangential to that, I'm going to ask one more question, David. You've written about how the state is a site of a power struggle, right? And that solutions need to exceed or be outside state structures, right? But we've also got this sort of tension between how do we work within the system that exists at the moment while also working for something transformatory. And so forgive me if this question is a lot of subordinate clauses, but how do we as allies on the outside both work to transform while also working within?
Yeah, I think that question is right on, and it's my belief that we really have to do both. I mean, I think of myself as someone who's very cautious and skeptical and wary and suspicious of government and state power, but I'm also a pragmatic person, and I would even describe myself as maybe a pragmatic anarchist. I mean, some of the most diehard anarchists I know are lawyers, and I go, really? You're an anarchist and you're working with the state every day? And they go, yeah, but I have a vision, right, of the future that might be very different. But now, as long as we have this government, this 800-pound gorilla, we got to deal with that. And so I guess, in addition to that, I would say, what we've seen certainly on the outside and on the inside over the last couple of years, where we've got COVID-19, we've got all these cascading, intersecting crises, is mutual aid, right? And so what happened in Texas recently, right, where the hell was the government when you have this polar vortex, people without power, food, water, et cetera? I mean, the government was like, hey, boil your water, right? Yeah, well, that would be easy enough if I had power to turn on, the freaking oven or the stove so I could heat up some water. Can't do that because I don't have freaking power. What am I going to do? But we know that so many activists came together in the state of Texas and places like Dallas and Houston through mutual aid and provided water, provided food, provided things that people needed. In the absence of the government, I have a friend who's a Russian immigrant who has learned English and all these other languages. And she is part of this collective, this community of folks in the city of New York, where they, right when the pandemic hit, they knew the government was not going to be there for people, were just ill prepared. They sewed tens of thousands of face masks all kinds of PPE for people, like crowdfunded this thing, made it happen, was handing out these PPE on the streets of New York. Government completely absent, AWOL, MIA. So people have had to do this, not only in this crisis, but of course, poor folks, indigenous folks, people of color, for whom the government is rarely there for us, have had to do that throughout our histories. This, as we know, if you've studied what's happening in prisons and you talk to folks who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, we see this as well. And it's harder, of course, on the inside. But, I didn't tell the story of Waylon Coleman, who's in MCI Norfolk in Massachusetts, the same prison that Malcolm X did time in. And this guy has hooked up with a group of allies on the outside and a group of folks, activists who are on the inside, and said, look, we got a problem where we need to get good quality water. And so this coalition of folks on the outside is called the Deeper Than Water Coalition, and they have helped raise money for Waylon Coleman and his colleagues on the inside to pay for water and to get bottled water in the inside. And so he had all of this bottled water inside his cell that he was amassing so that he could hand it out to his fellow inmates, his peers. And of course, what happened? The authorities said that that's contraband, and they put him in the hole for doing that. But prior to that, of course, the idea was mutual aid, right? So in the absence of the government doing what is necessary, providing people with the goods, the services to live, folks on the inside and the outside have been doing this work, and it's not easy. So I'm a real believer in the power of mutual aid historically and in the present and going forward, because we're going to continue to see these crises, and we're going to continue to see government fall flat on its face in its inability to give us what we need. But again, I'm pragmatic. And so when and where the government can do for us what we need them to do, I'm willing to put hold their feet to the fire and make sure they're doing that. But for me, the mistake that activists and scholars make is thinking the government is the only game in town. And I think it has to be one site, one source of the tools that we need. I don't want to be super fundamentalist about being an anarchist. Look, if you can show me how government can work, I'm down with that. So let's see if we can just get every tool in the toolkit. That's my approach. Thank you, Kate.
David, I have a question for you. I've seen it locally, but also what you've demonstrated is it just seems to be that brownfields, the second life of the brownfield, happens to be some sort of carceral facility, and I'm wondering if that's like baked into the strategic planning of those sites. Like we have the largest county jail in our region was built pretty much about 2 miles from where I grew up, which happens to be directly on top of a landfill. And so you just see this more and more often, and it just seems like it's baked in somehow strategically. And I'm wondering if there's any sense to that thinking.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm going to give a guarded answer to that because I don't know that I've got the full sort of data set that would sort of prove that. What I can say is that we do know that there are, if we look across the United States, there are tons of prisons and county jails that are within a mile, 3 miles of a hazardous waste facility or a landfill or a Superfund site. The question is, well, is that a level of exposure or proximity to those sites that is fundamentally different than what we find, for the average person in the United States? And it's not entirely clear that that is the case. But what, a student of mine, Harrison Ashby, she wrote a paper on this. What she points out is, well, even if that were the case, right, that the level of exposure or proximity to these sites is roughly the same as anybody else. The difference, though, and this is an important difference she points out, is that, if you're in a prison, right, or a jail, you have very little control over whether you can move in or move out of that place, right? And so not that everybody else has 100% control, over sort of their living space, their residential space, but people in carceral spaces have far little. And so so for her, that point is really important because it points out that in and of itself is an environmental injustice. But as you pointed out, and as others have pointed out, and we have in our research, there are tons of examples where we have, like Rikers Island, right? That jail is literally built on top of a landfill, right? The Northwest Detention Center, FCI Victorville, right, on top of, George Air Force Base, and the number of toxic chemicals there is just incredible. And so what really matters, as Harrison Ashby, my student, a former student, was pointing out, is that folks who are incarcerated just legally have far fewer rights than the rest of us in general, but also in particular in terms of occupational safety and health, in terms of wages, as we know, in terms of whether or not they can sue over exposure to or proximity to environmental hazards like the rest of us can. So I think it's that category of being somebody who is incarcerated that adds that extra level and layer of environmental injustice. And so we're doing that work right now to determine if there is a higher level of spatial proximity to those hazards than the rest of us. I suspect very strongly that the answer is going to be yes. But in terms of particular case studies, the level of proximity to exposure that we're finding in a lot of these cases is it's off the charts. It's off the charts. So for me, it's an example of how people who are on the other side of the prison walls should be able to build common cause with people who are behind bars, because we are all facing some degree of a range, a spectrum of exposure that is somewhat fluid. Thank you.
Thank you. Just calling out Kate's chat there about Sing Sing, the evacuation plan. Lock them in the cells. We're out. It seems to be. Yeah,
go ahead. I was going to say just the thinking of the state of New York on that one is that by the time you would get enough buses to evacuate 1,800 men, you would be putting the COs at too much risk. So lock them and leave.
That's right. And this, as you know, has been a concern. The whole evacuation plan and the fact that folks who are incarcerated are the last people anybody's thinking about in these institutions. That's been a concern that the campaign to fight toxic prisons, the Prison Ecology Project, and many folks who come before them have put front and center on the agenda. And it continues to be a problem. The South Central Jail in Charleston, West Virginia, was a site where we saw a massive problem where this, we had a toxic waste spill just up the river and of a chemical plant, and the residents, people who were not in prison, were told, hey, don't drink the water. There were evacuations appropriately there. And the people who are in this jail, no evacuation at all. And yet they were being exposed to the same chemicals that folks in the nearby towns were. Not a thought for these folks at all. The Orleans Parish Jail, right, when Hurricane Katrina hit, that's an infamous example where people know that, folks were left to their own devices and, nearly died in that jail while Hurricane Katrina hit. Many other examples. FCI Beaumont, the Federal Correctional Institution complex in Beaumont, Texas, 35 inches of rain hit in just a matter of hours when Hurricane Maria or Harvey hit there 2017, right next door to a massive complex of oil petrochemical facilities, where years prior, of course, we've had all of these oil spills on the ground in the soil. So when the hurricane hit and dropped, 36 inches of rain, this toxic cocktail, right, of water that was laced with hydrocarbons and petrochemicals that, of course, was then coming up to the ankles and the wastes of incarcerated folks at FCI Beaumont who were not evacuated. So this, I think, is like the low-hanging fruit, like the most basic thing we could expect from our governmental authorities. It's like, do you want people to drown? Do you want people to die in these situations of climate change-driven extreme weather events? No, at least I don't. Can we come up with a plan? And, at the very least, we could do that. On the other end, of course, one could say, well, we wouldn't have to worry about this if we didn't have prisons to begin with. So the abolitionists would say, hey, let's keep that in mind and keep that on the agenda. But yes, thank you for that question. This remains front and center. It's a real problem. And allies on the outside can do a lot to promote more sensible and compassionate disaster planning for our carceral spaces.
Last call. We got 3 minutes here if anyone's got a question, and we should start thinking about closing it up, I think. My God, there's just so much to digest, David. That was a stunning presentation. A very unsettling, but stunning presentation. Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it. And my goodness, so many great resources in the chat. Thank you for sharing these things, some of which I'm not even familiar with. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak with you and to exchange ideas and perspectives with you all today. And I'm super excited about catching so many of the other sessions that you've been hosting and recording for this amazing conference. So just kudos to the organizers, and thanks to everybody who showed up today, and just really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and to learn from you and to be in conversation. So my pleasure and my honor and my privilege to be with you today.
Thank you so much, David.
I think with that, we are adjourned here. I'll keep the link open here for a little bit if anyone wants to hang out and chat. Otherwise, that's it for the recording. Thank you again, David.